Enterprise Forum for August. And this is our 10th CFE Forum, so special celebration there. And I'd like to especially welcome any ECR or HDR members who are with us today or else going to be listening back to this one. So I'm Wendy Scaife, for those I haven't met, and I'm Director of the Australian Centre for Philanthropy and Nonprofit Studies here at QUT, and also Theme Leader for the Social Purpose theme within CFE. As always, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, the Turrbal and the Yugara people as the First Nations owners on the lands that QUT now stands. And we pay respect to their elders, their laws, customs and creation spirits, and recognise that these lands have always been places of research, teaching and learning. And we celebrate the fact that the important role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people continue to play within the QUT community. I'd also like to acknowledge that it is Wear Purple Day, so I have my purple scarf on here at QUT, and of course that's another 10th year anniversary, or number 10 anniversary, a 10th year of celebrating diversity and awareness for young people in the rainbow community. So today, without further ado, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Alexandra Williamson, who is another of our early career researchers within CFE and also a postdoctoral research fellow here at the ACPNS. So a few highlights about Alex to give you some background on our speaker today. And I'm well qualified because I've known Alex a lot of years and worked with Alex a lot of years and lived to tell the tale. So Alex has been part of ACPNS since 2011. She's worked on large projects, including Giving Australia. Her primary discipline is philanthropic studies, and she's the only Australian academic to bring both a very deep grant-making experience and practitioner experience to that role, as well as a significant scholarly experience in this area. I say that because Alex has got 2 master's degrees, one in philanthropy and social investment, and the other her Master of Business in Research, and of course her PhD, which was just completed in 2019. Alex is also the only academic in Australia to have interned with our Charities Commission, and she has been busy, as I mentioned, since completing her PhD last year. She was the only DECRA applicant from the business faculty, and she's the author of many and an emerging growing number of peer-reviewed articles, and she's written in collaboration now with 12 different people, both in Australia and internationally. So our format today is, as always, Alex is going to present for about 25 minutes. This will be followed by your questions, but I'm sure that if you wanted to add anything on the chat screen in the meantime, please feel very welcome to do that. I suggest at this point that you mute and perhaps hide your video, and maybe when we get to the question stage to re-show your video. So Alex today is going to be focusing in on the really fascinating topic of place-based philanthropy, and place-based being a concept, of course, that covers a whole range of different areas. So Alex, welcome and thank you for presenting as the first social purpose presenter, theme presenter for CFE today.
Thank you, Wendy. That was a very generous introduction. So, as Wendy said, what I'm going to be taking you through today is the research that for me is both based out of my PhD, but also a future focus for my work. And the research stream is around this idea of place-based giving or place-based philanthropy. And the genesis of this research came from my PhD, which was examining accountability in public philanthropic foundations. So philanthropic foundations are structures or organizations which either one donor or a close group of donors, or in the case of my PhD, a group of public donors. They use these foundations to plan or to structure a program of future philanthropic giving. Now, because my PhD examined public foundations, I was expecting that when I started the research that the place would be relevant for part of my sample, those organizations that are called community foundations, and that these organisations I expected would have a very strong connection with a particular place that's inherent in their name. But what surprised me is that of my sample, almost all of the foundations that I spoke with were able to engage with place when they spoke about their accountability. And so one of the questions I asked as part of my PhD was, you know, if I gave you the right map on the right scale, would you be able to draw a line around the area in which you work? And a really high number of them were able to do that. And that was quite a surprising finding for me. And I took that particular element of my findings and developed it into a journal article. Now, just quickly here, I'm going to touch on some of the distinctive characteristics of philanthropy as a form of funding for organisations, non-profit and charitable organisations. Philanthropic foundations can fund innovation, and they frequently talk about doing that. Not all of them do in practice, but philanthropy, because it has few stakeholders to whom they have a regulatory obligation, and where they do, it's pretty light touch. They are able to move quickly when they wish to. They're able to take risks in funding, so they can fund things that are controversial, unpopular, difficult to fund without you know, immediate results. So philanthropy can be long-term, multi-generational, and these foundations are often set up in perpetuity. So that really frames the way that they can think about their work and their funding. And they can take multiple approaches to addressing issues across multiple program or cause areas, if you like. So having come up with this emergent theme around place from my PhD, I obviously went to the literature and started sort of seeing what there was already, and found that there were, in fact, a growing number of articles around the time that I was writing this paper around this concept of place-based philanthropy or giving with a focus on a particular place. So the article that I wrote in partnership with my PhD supervisors was really beginning to this process of joining an emergent discourse in academia. And it's also with the topic of the DECRA application that I submitted that Wendy mentioned, went in March, and obviously no outcome as yet. So this slide and the image credit here goes to Chloe Parker, who's the research assistant who put it together, but it simply shows you the breadth of the literature that does exist around place-based and place-based giving. The bright colours, the hexagon shapes there, are the main themes, if you like. As you can see, the blue one, there's quite a lot of literature around philanthropy, place-based giving, and some of the other elements that connect in through the research. So there's things there about public policy, around entrepreneurship, and around disaster philanthropy. Community is a big one. Environmental philanthropy is quite a strong stream there. The one that really I find fascinating, though, is the one around crime there. So there is indeed a paper about place and crime, integrating the sociology of place. And it amuses me, I suppose, to see all of the different places in which, in the literature, in which this place-based focus does emerge. So the story of this particular paper, titled Perceptions and Conceptions of Place in Australian Public Foundations, submitted to Nonprofit and Voluntary Sector Quarterly, which is one of the 3 top journals in the nonprofit space. It's a Q1, submitted right at the end of 2018, 2 rounds so far of revise and resubmit, each with 3 reviewers plus additional comments from the editors. So it's been a long journey. I'm moderately optimistic that it might yet get over the line, but you know, we shall see. There are, in fact, plenty of other journals which do focus on place, this concept, and that has also surprised me in the literature, so I'm looking forward to exploring some of those in future. Very briefly, the methodology for the PhD and the paper that has been submitted. The thing about working and researching in philanthropy in Australia is it's a research context where there are really large gaps in between the empirical work that exists. So often, particularly PhD students are told to sort of find your gap and to focus on something that hasn't done before. And when you're researching in philanthropy, it's almost the opposite problem. You have to try and find a framework from which your research can build. So the purpose of the interviews that I did, the interviews were about talking to the senior leaders of these philanthropic foundations to get their perspectives on accountability. And as I said, this idea of being accountable to the people and to a place was a really strong emergent theme. I used a purposive sample because I was really interested in getting the broadest possible range of voices. So there were participants from 5 Australian states and different subcategories of these public foundations. And the coding of those interview transcripts, I was using both theoretically derived codes around accountability in particular, but the emergent themes of which place was one were very much focused on these organisations' identity and how that informed their accountability. So place is, of course, one of those really overarching meta concepts, and it's in developing the paper, the first thing I chose was a theoretical frame around place that I could use. And I went back to a book by Agnew back in 1987. He's a geographer, and he had come up with what I regarded as quite a useful framework, which was around location, locale, and sense of place. So he identified those 3 elements of place as a simple and yet deep enough way of people engaging with and understanding this concept of place. But interestingly, sort of 16 years after that first paper in the book in 2003, they revisited it and published a journal article which reflected back on the book and what had changed since. And there were a couple of additions there. There was this idea of technological places or online places, which obviously wasn't a theme back in '87. They also then discussed the relevance of scale when you were considering place, and that the places at a small scale were very different from places at a large national scale, perhaps. And it also added in the really important temporal element of considering place and how places change over time. And that's quite relevant to philanthropy and philanthropic understandings. So just briefly, this idea of location, locale, and sense of place being the 3 elements by which you can understand and work with place. I was quite drawn to this because I thought it would have quite a practical application for philanthropic foundations, and it was a way or a framework from which they could begin to get a better understanding of the work that they did in terms of place-based giving. I actually, in fact, ran the paper past a colleague who's the CEO of a particular philanthropic foundation, and her response was, "Can you hurry up and get it published, please, because I want to use it with my board." Disappointingly for her, the academic process is far more drawn out than she expected. But location, I suppose, in terms of the foundations that I spoke to, location was that question about could you draw a line on a map? And a typical response there was, yes, we fund in these 3 local government areas, or we fund in this city, the name of this city and the boundaries of this area. Locale, which is an understanding of place that comes back to social connections and networks. In the interviews that I did, that came out most as being about the expert knowledge that these foundations held about the players or the actors in a place. So the non-profit organisations and the leaders, the community leaders in a place with whom these foundations worked. And the final of the 3 elements that Agnew identified, that idea of sense of place, that was a fascinating one because it often came back to the idea of people wanting a sense of giving back through their philanthropy, that they had some emotional connection or some part of their life story was connected with a place. And this was really beautifully illustrated by one of the foundations who was talking about their scholarships program. It was a regional foundation, and they some of their funding went to support students leaving their place, and if you like, and going to university. And there was this strong sense of reciprocity or mutual attachment to a place and to the their identity being linked with that. So in the paper, what we did was to take those three elements of place, those three themes, and examine them and how they related to Foundation's understanding of their work. And obviously enough, there was quite a significant overlap in between those three themes, and that's what's illustrated in this figure here. So just for example, the overlap between location and or geographic place and sense of place, or those emotional ties to places, is that concept of wanting to give back to a place that was important to a donor in their lifetime. The overlap between, for example, location or geographic places and locale and social networks or networks of people was often about philanthropic funding for community spaces where groups of people could gather. So, you know, a community house, a sports or recreation centre, a park or something like that, or a service in those places that was funded by philanthropy. At a larger scale though, zooming the lens out a little bit, for philanthropic foundations, one of the choices that they have to make as organisations is whether they're going to give to one particular issue in many places, or whether they're going to give to many issues in one particular place. Now, of course, foundations can and do use a hybrid version of both of those models. But for example, a foundation that is particularly about youth employment may say, okay, we're going to address youth employment in multiple places, so in urban, in regional, in rural settings, different age groups, etc. But if they decide that they're going to focus on one particular town or a suburb or even a state in terms of place, they'll then say, well, what are the important issues in that place? And how can we as a foundation actually go and support all of these multiple issues that will support the place and enable it to be more effective in achieving the goals that it defines. So at a local level, philanthropic foundations can act as aggregators and enhancers of givings, both in terms of the dollars that are given, but also the giving of knowledge and the sharing and the generosity in that community. And that idea of being local or localism is quite appealing to philanthropists because it connects very much with them as an individual. Now, the tension is between that and if you like, the other end of the spectrum, which is philanthropy at a global scale. And that links into these trends which are quite quite studied at the moment in philanthropy around this idea of effective altruism or giving directly. And essentially the idea of those programs is that as a donor, you should figure out where on the planet, where on earth you can give and to what causes your dollars will have the greatest measurable impact. And you should fund there, regardless of where that may be. So those are kind of the two different ends of the spectrum in philanthropy, and my interest is focused on this idea of local giving, or giving that is focused on place. So again, on a larger scale, when you're talking about place-based philanthropy and place-based giving, it's quite challenging to take the international literature and the research findings and sort of transplant them into an Australian context. And obviously this is a problem with place-based giving itself. So the context matters, and it matters due to geography, due to culture, due to history, due to the natural environment, and also to the role of government at all levels. So when you're a researcher and you're looking at place, and particularly philanthropy around place, there are difficulties around the generalizability of findings that you take from a different context, particularly a different international context. And the effect of that is that you have to kind of tweak in and look at different parts of research and try and understand what is going to be applicable, and also, if it's not, why it's not, what the differences are. So extending this particular research stream, I've thinking about and discussing a possible research project in next year, 2021, looking at community foundations, those with a particular geographic focus from the outset that's defined in their mission. And I'm looking at doing some comparative work with Canada. And Canada is a really great comparator for Australia in philanthropy. The countries sort of share the same geographic spread. They are also similar in population size, and as Commonwealth countries, they share a legal framework around charitable law that informs much of these giving structures and the work that they can do. And excitingly, there's also a new journal article currently under development with some colleagues from Carleton University in Ottawa. And it's a special issue of the Journal of Business Ethics. And the title of the special issue is Putting Partnerships in Their Place, Moral and Material Processes of Place-Based Respect, Repair and Renewal. And so this new paper that we're developing in a sense builds from the one that, the first one that is still under review. So that first paper was examining these public foundations and looking at those three dimensions within their place-based work and how they understood what it was that they did within a place. The new paper is about developing three models, three conceptual models of the ways in which foundations choose to work in places and with places. And so I'm really looking forward to developing that with the two co-authors that I have on that paper. So I'm conscious of the time, which is ticking along. This is in the final slide, and what I'm raising here is some questions that I'm thinking about, researching, looking through the literature, but would really welcome some discussion and some comments today. There are two main issues here. The first is this idea of partnerships in places. And this is a really important one because philanthropic foundations cannot actually deliver programs and services themselves. They must work through making grants to nonprofit organisations as beneficiaries. And so partnerships are essential, but there are differences, I think, between partnerships, collaborations, and this idea of an assemblage, which is just sort of a grouping, if you like, of actors and artifacts and environments. So I think that's something that needs to be teased out a little further. I think there are real questions and issues around translation, where parties in these partnerships don't have the same understanding of concepts. And so how you can ensure that all the parties in the stakeholders in the partnership are actually understanding the same things when they're talking about issues. And of course, replication, being able to take an approach or a model from one place and put it into another. There's this idea with places as being this idea of reciprocity around, you know, and reflexivity, where place is both an actor and a context, and how that actually affects foundations' work. And then I think there's some interesting things about what are the actual normative assumptions within the body of literature about what foundations should be doing. And that ties neatly into the second, I suppose, area that I'm interested in, which is this concepts of ethics and equity for foundations. So foundations, by nature of the fact that they bring money to these partnerships, also bring power, and also often choose to work in places deliberately where there are entrenched multi-generational issues around inequity, and where people can be disadvantaged, overlooked, marginalized, disconnected. This work relates very tightly to the Sustainable Development Goals, the particular ones around the need for global partnerships for sustainable development. That's Goal 17. Goal 10 is around inequality within and among countries. The 11 is about cities as places being inclusive, safe, resilient and sustainable. And Goal 3 is about healthy lives and well-being for people of all ages. And of course, lastly, it's impossible to do a forum presentation in 2020 without talking about COVID. And I think it will be fascinating to see whether, coming back to that previous slide, which is talking about the tensions between localism and working on a global scale, I think COVID is just going to enhance those tensions and that divide with some people going back to working locally as an impact of the decreased travel, and others saying, no, we need to be addressing this pandemic on a global scale. So I would really value thoughts and comments as to what directions for the research, to papers that may be of interest, thoughts, challenges, anything else that you would care to contribute. Thanks, Wendy.
Thanks, Alexandra, for staying on time and for providing a thought-provoking insight into your article and also into the area that you would love to be able to do a DECRA, complete your DECRA activities in, should that be successful in your first year, which we all know is a difficult step. So I would invite people now to put yourselves back on screen if you wish, and to unmute and to ask any questions. And I note that Linda Bennison, thank you, you've told Alex that it's a fabulous presentation. And so I guess there's a range of questions that Alex is posing to us there. And I know we've got some good minds around, and I'd love to see you actually engaging with some of those questions. So I'll invite you to do that either by the chat screen or by unmuting. But firstly, whilst you're thinking and making that happen, Alex, could I ask you, you have this rare background as a practitioner, knowing the sort of principles and the understanding that you get from that framework that you're using there, the locale framework, etc. How would that have made you think and act differently in practice?
Look, I think that it's easy for foundations, I think, to start from issues. And I think that's historically where Australian foundations have come from. As I said, that they identify something that's important to them, a cause area, something that's relevant, and they excuse me, and they go looking for the organizations who are working in particular places, who are doing effective, I suppose, cutting edge work that's innovative and is proving to have great outcomes. Now, I suppose what's happened over the last decade perhaps is that foundations have come to realize a little bit more that can have a scattergun effect, that there's a loss that is inherent in having gains being made in different places in different ways, and that you lose both momentum and shared knowledge through that approach. So what I think is sort of the current trend is that foundations are edging towards the place-based approach, but not committing to it 100%, that they're hedging their bets and continuing to use a bit of both of those approaches. But I do think it's going to be fascinating to see the outcomes of COVID on foundations, given that they have been strongly called upon to increase their giving and to, if you like, let go of a lot of the terms and conditions around what they're funding.
Thanks, Alex, and thank you, Peter Green, for your excellent question there. Peter, I don't know if you want to unmute and ask it yourself. I'd invite you to do that if you wish.
Thanks, Wendy. Thanks very much for the great presentation, Alex. I was just wondering if there was a most critical or primary learning that you've gotten so far about place. You may have just answered it in what you were saying, that your work's uncovered thus far.
In terms of the foundations themselves, Peter, I think when they do start to use or choose to start using a place-based way of working, I think one of the things that seems to frequently emerge is how resource intensive it is for foundations themselves. And one of the oddities about philanthropic foundations is that although they have, by their very nature, they have a a capital base and asset base of funds, they tend to be really, really lightly staffed and resourced as organisations themselves, because particularly for the boards of directors, there's always this tension between, well, do we have more staff and pay salaries, or do we actually try and keep the staff at a minimum level and use those dollars instead to support organisations? So there's that tension, and what effectively it tends to mean is that foundations have really low staffing levels, and when they start to work in a place-based way, those partnerships are critically important. And they, I think, often rapidly discover that they don't have the internal resources themselves to be able to effectively work in those partnerships in place. And I think that's one of the sort of the surprising things that was mentioned both in my PhD about sort of how resource intensive this particular giving framework is. And that's also emerging in the literature as well.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Alex.
Now, Alex has raised a few points there that I know she would love you to engage with. So I wonder if there are people out there who've done any work or had any thoughts around partnerships, collaborations, and assemblages. And I noticed that we have Martin online, our theme leader from entrepreneurship from ACE. And I don't know, Martin, if there's any of these points that Alex has raised that resonates with the work that you have been doing as well.
Yeah, hi everybody. Of course, there's lots of overlap, and so this is one of our core foci to discuss the overlap to other centers, to other researchers, and really interested in these things, and to engage in fruitful discussions, of course. So yes, Alex, let's have more discussions on that and plan some exciting projects.
Thanks, Martin. And I can see that Gemma is writing a little comment here, I think, or Gem, you can unmute your microphone if that's easier.
Thanks, Wendy. Yes, I was going to write my comment, but I'll speak it instead. Thank you, Alex. Really enjoyable presentation. My question was around, have you in your work seen some standout examples of where the philanthropic organisations have established really strong and effective partnerships, and what might they be? And then translating that to the philanthropic nature that QUT has. I know we've got Margot and the team online today. What can we translate into our philanthropic activities as an organisation?
Mm-hmm. So there are, yes, examples in Australia and also some in Queensland. The Queensland Council of Social Services, so QCOS, has an interest group, if you like, around place-based working, and they bring in some academic researchers as well as a group of very active practitioners. There are, interestingly, quite a lot of examples of governments choosing to fund in place-based ways, particularly for rural and regional areas, less so in urban areas. And the Queensland government is certainly doing that with a few initiatives at the moment in central Queensland, so Mackay, Rockhampton, in that space. And those are largely around, coming out of QCOS, of course, partnerships with QCOS, those are largely around themes around community wellbeing, health, mental health in particular. But one of my favourites, to be honest, is a South Australian foundation, which is called the Faye Fuller Foundation. And they, probably almost 2 years ago now, I think, decided that they would work on a particular issue, which was mental health, community mental health and wellbeing. But they decided that they would work make a very long-term commitment, which is unusual for a foundation. So they committed to 10 years of funding, and they ran an expression of interest program for South Australian regional and rural towns. And from a short list of 10, I think they came to 3 or perhaps 4 towns, and committed to supporting mental health programs in these places that were put forward by the towns themselves. And the mental health as a theme could be addressed through employment, it could be addressed through the arts, it could be addressed through environmental programs as well. So that's one thing that a program that I've loved watching that develop, and I'm very keen to see how it progresses. They're sort of in their first year of funding at the moment, so there's a long way to go. In terms of what QUT does, I know that through both the Staff Community Welfare Fund, which I think is a really lovely part of QUT's identity, but also through even the Learning Potential Fund, I think that QUT does in fact work in a place-based way in terms of the support that it provides to the community, and that's perhaps a lens that might be used in a strategic way in future. And yeah, happy to talk about that further.
Thanks, Alex. And we've got a great question from Louise Baldwin, based over in Health. Louise, are you online? Would you like to ask it personally?
Thanks, Wendy. Hi, Alex. That was absolutely terrific. Thank you for that. I was also just reflecting on my practice experience, and you may have mentioned this because I did just come in a tiny bit late, but when you were talking about regional areas and also that local impact, it reminded me of my observations in practice of really fantastic volunteers working in regional Queensland and fundraising very hard, but wanting to see the fruits of their labour with equipment or programs or services that went back into their town. So, for example, if they'd fundraised, you know, they wanted to see some new equipment at the hospital that could benefit local people or something like that. But often underlying that within the philanthropic foundation, there were system barriers that didn't always allow sort of the fragmentation of those funds when they came in to then be duly allocated back to those local areas. And I was just wondering whether that was also something that you had identified in your research.
Yeah, the short answer is yes. It's one of the things that was really interesting was the way that place linked with parochialism, and the way that there was often a really strong link between people wanting to give donations to a foundation if they could be absolutely sure that it was going to go back to support that community. And that was a really important part of their understanding and conceptualization of place. It was very much about ownership, belonging, and almost sometimes about exclusion. So those geographic borders could result in a bit of a them and us mentality. And that was actually quite clearly expounded in one example of who would be eligible for scholarships. And there'd been sort of strong community tensions about the interpretation of what a place was and who was in and who was out, if you like. So yeah, that element was absolutely there. You know, the unkind version is to call it being parochial and exclusionary. The kind version is that people give to what they know and what's important, and they do want to see those tangible outcomes. But the idea of wanting that commitment, that security of knowledge, some foundations were starting to address that by setting up accounts within their larger foundation structure, which aren't legally separate, and therefore there can be no legally binding guarantee, but nevertheless it's a way of identifying and allocating funds that are donated for a particular cause area.
Thanks, Louise, and thanks, Alex.
Alex.
And Kylie Kingston, one of our PhD students. Kylie, would you care to share with Alex your thoughts from your background about assemblages?
Hi, where's my screen, my camera? Hi, Alex, great presentation. I really like your diagram. That I kind of also wanted to ask you about if you've actually applied that thinking in that you've sort of developed through that, or if you've just worked that paper was more focused on developing it rather than then applying the thinking in that. But separate to that, just in relation to the questions you had at the end, you know, I like assemblages thinking. So just picking up on that, when you've written that the difference between partnerships, collaborations and assemblages made me think that for me, the whole idea about assemblages, and I know that there's many different perspectives and theories around assemblages, but the thing that's important to me, I think, is that the assemblages, that they're not just things that sit beside each other, but the arrangement of the parts of the assemblage actually produces something that otherwise would not be there. So then I started to think about the partnerships and collaborations, and what the arrangement of the things in those partnerships and collaborations actually produces that it is otherwise not there. And that led me back to thinking about your diagram and the locale and the different elements of that, that could actually be things that the arrangements that you're identifying are actually producing as a result of the arrangement itself. Am I making any sense?
Yeah. Yeah,
so I just thought that that could be an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah. So the first part of the question, that particular figure was developed through the paper, and so no, it's not something that I've, if you like, tested through subsequent research. Although the forthcoming paper that I'm working on at the moment is it's sort of mostly a conceptual paper, but using some, if you like, a small number of illustrative cases, and it will be interesting to see whether that's possible or not to map that sort of figure onto the work of some observed foundations. Yeah, and in terms of the differences between, you know, assemblages, collaborations, and partnerships, I think the fascinating thing for me about assemblages is the idea, and I think those multiple understandings that you mentioned are relevant here, but the idea that an assemblage can involve non-human things.
Yep.
And I really liked that, was quite attractive to me in trying to understand and develop ideas of place, because, you know, places are about so much more than just the people in them. And yeah, I think I've got definitely some further work to do in that one.
Alex, can I just add two more points? So that local sense, could you also study it from a social identity perspective, which also would include an out-group perspective? We are the in-group here, or whatever it is, emotion, whatever, but there's another group out there that is not our group. And the second question is, just from my personal view, the entrepreneurship view, who is the agent here? Who's driving it? Who shows the agency, so to speak? And what is the structure part? And that's more an abstract question. And how do you think that plays a role, structure and agency, in your model?
Yeah. So yeah, thank you. I do think there's something about sort of in-group and out-group that that can happen, because of course when a foundation chooses to work in a place, the action that they do is they support with funding, and an organization or multiple organizations receive those funds. Inevitably others don't. And so, yeah, there is this in-group, out-group tension which can happen, and can in fact be very divisive in communities and in places. And, you know, it's easy to have sort of the rose-colored glasses on philanthropy and think it's always wonderful, and that, you know, it's about generosity and giving, and it is those things, but it can have unintended consequences. And yeah, that idea of who's included, who's excluded, I think is something to explore further. And the idea of agency, and in a sense, the foundations use their beneficiary organizations as their agents in places, because they themselves are hamstrung, that they cannot actually engage and deliver services themselves. Having said that, though, they can do and perform other roles around convening, mentoring, providing skills, providing knowledge from other areas, acting as a vector for ideas. And so it does get quite sort of tangled up as to whether the agent or the agency is held by the beneficiary organisations, or whether it's the foundations themselves who are acting as agents simply through their role in the provision of funding.
Thank you.
And thank you, Martin, for another excellent question. Thank you, Alex, for your presentation today, and thank you to everybody who participated and hopefully took away some of your own thoughts for your own work, either in how Alex has approached this or how she has presented it, or this challenging new area of research in philanthropy and place-based areas. I'd like to acknowledge as well, I've just noticed that we have one of our very new PhD students, Zoe, online with us, one of Alex and Yu's PhD students, and wanted to extend a particular welcome. And also wanted to thank Gemma, who organises this series on behalf of us all within CFE. I wanted to remind you to get in touch with Alex or with ACPNS. Our values are generosity, integrity, and collaboration. So we're very happy to always speak with others about work. And please do link with Alex or with ACPNS and our team on social media. And also finally, just to announce that our next speaker in the Future of Global Leaders series is the outstanding CEO of the highly successful Royal Flying Doctors Service. That's Meredith Stabe, and that will be on the afternoon of the 16th of September, Wednesday, 16th of September, and I think invitations will be in your mailbox next week. Meredith is an outstanding presenter, so I think you probably should pop that one in as something that's really worth doing. So thank you, Alex, and thank you all, and I bid you a good morning and a happy weekend.